I can start. Okay, are they going to come back on screen? Okay. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second session. My name is Jiffer Bourguignon, and I am an editor of Internomics, Review of European Economic Policy, and we are co-hosting the event today with Rugal. We're very pleased to be a co-host, and as this is a collaboration, we would like to let you know that all of the participants in both of the sessions today will be contributing an article based on their presentations this afternoon, which will be coming out in our next issue, which will be out in July. You can find that in its entirety on our website. So, it is my pleasure to host this extremely timely session this afternoon on some of the political and security concerns on EU enlargement, specifically focusing on the case of Ukraine, but also looking at the case of the trio, Moldova and Georgia, as well as we've already discussed earlier, some of the other members that are, or potential future members who are in the application process. Last week, several European leaders traveled to Kiev by train, and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said Ukraine belongs to the European family. Italy's Prime Minister Mario Draghi added, the most important message of our visit is that Italy wants Ukraine in the EU. In this session, we've asked participants to go a little deeper into some of the political and security issues surrounding the enlargement process. And that's what we are going to do this afternoon. I'm going to introduce each participant before they give their presentation, and then we will have questions from the audience and from online, from those of you who are watching online after. Okay, so we're going to start first with Ilona Solugu. Ilona is the head of Vox Ukraine since 2019. Previously, she was a member of the editorial board and the supervisory board of Vox Ukraine, and also was the director of economic policy studies at the Kiev School of Economics. Until 2010, Ilona worked in the banking sector, performing market and operational risk analysis. Her research focuses on a number of topics, including Ukrainian and global economy, social policy, and the media. Ilona, we're very pleased to have you with us today. I turn the floor over to you.
For having me here. Let me switch to full screen mode. I hope it works this time. I should make a little correction that since 2021-22, I'm not no longer the head of the Vox Ukraine, but I'm a scientific editor of this organization. I relocated and therefore I stepped down from the CEO position. Nevertheless, I work for this organization, and now I have an honor to be present here and to present a few slides on Ukrainian relations. And as you see, those have been quite intense since 1991, although there were, I would say, ups and downs. Nevertheless, Ukraine participates in a lot of European initiatives, and the main thing, of course, was the association agreement signed in 2014 and enacted in 2017. But also there are a number of other programs, and very important is the connection, synchronization of the energy grid of Ukrainian and European electric grid. A few other issues include economic cooperation. Well, do you see my slides actually?
Yes, we do, Ilona. Can everyone see them well? Is there any way you could make them full screen?
Well, I don't know what happened, but I switched to full screen mode. I apologize for that. Probably something is wrong with my computer. Anyway, as you can see on the second slide, we have very intense trade relations, especially since 2014. Obviously, now Ukraine has about 40% of its trade with the EU and 70% of FDI. And when it comes to investment from Ukraine to other countries, the EU is like 95% of that. Public opinion, obviously, you can see that if you ask people in general, there were also some switches in the public opinion since 2000s. And at first, many people believed that it was possible perhaps to integrate both sides, both like CIS or Russia and the EU. But since 2014, clearly the EU is the preferred option, and these surveys run until 2019, but in the last 2 years, the support for the EU integration obviously increased, and in March, the latest survey showed that was 91% of Ukrainians. And the reasons, I think, are understood. So we can say that at first, the European integration in Ukraine was promoted by a small number of people, like a small number of activists or public officials, but eventually it became the majority of people also started to support this. And of course, the EU has been very much a driver of reforms in Ukraine. My organization started to follow the reforms since 2015, and by this time, we have more than 1,000 legislative acts. And here you can see this estimate, this index that shows that this legislation was actually moving Ukraine towards the more competitive, more market economy, and economy that would be more attractive for investment and friendly for business and so on. And here you may see the one negative development, which was Constitutional Court canceling the e-declaration, electronic declaration legislation. But at that time, many people, including me, went to the streets to protest against that, and eventually this was reversed. So like, this highlights the strength of the civil society in Ukraine.
Ilona, if I could interrupt for just a second. Here we are still seeing the first slide. EU-Ukraine 30 plus years of relations. I think we need to...
That's very unfortunate.
Can you click on the slide that you would like to discuss?
Actually, I'm clicking on them, but it doesn't work. I don't know why.
Okay.
No.
Okay. Well then, go ahead. Why don't you continue? Oh, wait. Here we are. Here we are.
Okay.
We are now on intense reforms since 2014.
Well, sorry. I'll show just briefly show the public opinion and reforms. Yeah. So this one was what I told just a minute ago, and this was reverse of canceling of your declarations with people protests. So the most reforms since 2015 were in the spheres of governance and the business environment. And I know that people are really worried about corruption in Ukraine, but if we see that anti-corruption reforms were also quite intense. This is this index. Here I show only the index that relates to the government area, and in the anti-corruption, almost half of the progress was due to changes in processes, not in some tackle corruption directly, although of course those anti-corruption infrastructure is really important too, but the major progress was in terms of, for example, public procurement, where you just put everything online and there is no longer any room for that or any opportunities for that. So this will be, I think, important for the future reconstruction of Ukraine, because obviously we aim for reconstruction of not only buildings and roads, but also first of all, probably for construction of strong institutions and changing the way the decisions are made. Of course, everyone in Ukraine understands that the process of EU admission, if and when it starts, will be very much conditional and depend on what Ukraine does. And frankly speaking, the organizations like MY and many other civil society organizations were really very frustrated when previously the European Commission would issue another macrofinancial tranche to Ukraine without Ukraine implementing conditions that were underlying the receipt of this tranche. So this way, I would say this roadmap for the EU is important, but it should be there and it should have the final goal of membership, which will be like anchoring of reforms, which was also discussed in the previous session. And the last few issues that I would like to highlight are that there are several questions that will need to be answered, and probably when the Ukraine joins the EU will be quite different organizations from what it is now, because it will need to reform, I think, the decision-making processes within, and some probably more. It will have more common policies and including common, perhaps, foreign policy and policy with respect to accession of other countries. And I'm glad to see that these issues are already being discussed, but like this process of accession of the EU, Moldova will, I think, invigorate this discussion. The second tough question is what it's actually a war of Russia on Ukraine, and it started in 2014. And to take a more broader view, it's a war of Russia on Europe and on the collective West, because we have very different values. If Europe and so to say the US and other countries are based on individualistic values, in Russia it's people should be for the state, and it's a typical imperial thinking, I would say. And as any empire, Russia will eventually dissolve, and EU should be prepared for that as well, and formulate accordingly the Russian policy. And of course, we see that the world security system needs reform as well. Who will be leading this process? I think the EU will have a crucial role for that, but this requires also some thinking and some perhaps return to the basics to answer all those tough questions that have been there for quite a long time, but now they finally need their answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilona. Thank you for the presentation. As we didn't have as much time to take questions from online in the first session, I'm going to try to incorporate a few more of those. And we do have one that's come in. Someone asks, why is Eastern Partnership no longer enough? And what additional benefits would candidate status bring to Ukraine? Ilona.
I think the last summit of Eastern Partnership was in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. So it's like has been very slow in the last few years. But let's be honest, like, why do we invent other institutions if we have the EU, right? We can have all kinds of working groups or all kinds of initiatives, but eventually Europe should be united, and it will be stronger if it is united and based on values and developed together.
Okay, thank you. We're going to talk more about that in just a minute. But first, I would like to introduce our next presenter. And she is the one who's here in person. This is Dr. Tina Teen, and you're going to have to correct me with your last name, Akvlediani. Okay. Tina is a research fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies at the Foreign Policy Unit and a leader of the CEP's Young Thinkers Initiative. Her expertise and publications cover the EU's trade and neighborhood policies with a specific focus on the Eastern Partnership and the EU's association agreements and deep and comprehensive areas, specifically with Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. She has been a visiting scholar and lecturer at the University of Warsaw for 7 years and is currently affiliated with several research centers based in Tbilisi. Tina holds a doctorate degree in economics from the University of Warsaw, and she also holds a master's in international economics from the University of Warsaw, and European economic studies from the College of Europe, and is a very sought-after commentator for several international media channels. And she is here to present for us today. Tina.
Thank you so much for this very generous introduction. Indeed, as much as I want to talk more about economics and political cooperation between Ukraine and the EU, I will just focus on the topic of today's panel, more on security and political angles of it. As I'm struggling a bit with the microphone, maybe you could, the technical team could just lower the volume. That would just be great. Voila. I hope this is better now. Okay, very good. With this, so I think the good starting point, also echoing the discussion on the first session, could indeed be talking about enlargement based on the accession criteria, and where could the trio applicants stand in these matters. And I think here Ilona's presentation already also gave a very good background, that indeed, because these three countries had in place association agreements, which are quite deep and comprehensive in their nature, they do not start from the scratch, and there is a lot implemented, a lot of EU acquis that has been already in place and approximated. We can already read this in the assessments of the European Commission that came out last Friday. And overall, there is a satisfactory track record in terms of the implementation on Ukraine, Moldova, and for Georgia, they even mentioned it's a positive track record as a country has higher rankings than the other two. So this is a very good starting point, mainly featuring the administrative capacity and economic criteria, particularly focusing on Ukraine. This is the country in the middle of the war, which still votes the laws, it functions, it tries proposes new policies also in terms of energy, and I think this already points out then the resilience the country could still have in the middle of the war, which is again promising in this direction. The key issues here are indeed the political criteria, which again point at EU fundamentals, and I see that there are a lot of skepticism also in the EU capital, in the EU member states, when they ask, are these countries ready to join the European Union? And of course, building democracies, and we are speaking still about the post-Soviet countries, these are fragile democracies. They come with a lot of issues with informal governance, corruption, rule of law, reforms, which are very much incomplete. So these are the issues that still have to be dealt by the trio, but we should neither forget that candidacy is just opening a new chapter for them, and becoming the members of the European Union doesn't happen overnight. As we all agree, it's going to be long and complex process, and this is going to be the merit-based, right? As the countries progress with their reforms, then it will be then also progress achieved on the accession talks. And the way we can see that indeed is this granting candidacy could be the way to tie these countries into the reform paths, those reforms. The other things is what does it actually mean for the European Union in terms of security, in terms of its political role? And that is the key question for the European Union. I mean, it's quite clear why the trio would like to join the European Union, because let's put it bluntly, for their survival as democratic states, this is the only solution, because you cannot build a democracy when you border Russia, and I think we saw that quite clearly. We saw that over the past wars and past military invasions. It's very difficult to talk about democracy and, building sectoral cooperation when you have to survive the wars, right? So for these countries, this is the only solution. For the European Union, this again brings back the existential question. To what extent European Union wants and is ready to be a geopolitical actor in this region where it had its neighborhood policy for more than a decade, right? So, and there was the question about the Eastern Partnership. Maybe with that, I will also respond from my part on the question. Eastern Partnership was the outcome itself with the war vis-a-vis Georgia, right, back in 2008. That was a war child initiative. And what we could observe, it really lacked the end goal. There was never really clarity what was the future of the Eastern Partnership. And also within the past decade, the 6 Eastern Partnership members, really developed and followed quite different paths, right? Following their choices for future and foreign policies. Now we have Belarus, not even a member of the Eastern Partnership platform anymore. We have Armenia, part of the member of the Eurasian Economic Union. Azerbaijan still passing the last mile to conclude any deal with the European Union, as the parties cannot agree on the fundamental rights as well, so including them into the deal. So we have a clear division on the Eastern Partnership. We have the trio, and we do have the rest, and this now putting the trio in the agenda of the enlargement in a way, bringing them from the neighborhood to the enlargement files of the European Union can finally deliver the clarity on the Eastern Partnership. I'd say some parts of it, some countries that have been ready to commit to more. While this is really not clear whether it can survive and what it can offer to the other 3 countries and what it can offer to the 6 countries as a whole, because common framework is, I think, declining. And as we speak, the country split in between of Russia and the European Union. How do you want to talk about, let's say, connectivity or cybersecurity when there are obviously different rules? And if one aligns with the Russia or Eurasian Economic Union, it's very difficult to come then into the data privacy or the data flows regulation of the European Union. It's just technically could be very difficult, not even speaking about political will in these countries. So there is a big question mark. What can Eastern Partnership still offer? Obviously, there would be very good to talk about here digital, maybe Green Deal dimension. But again, this requires basic trust between the parties, maybe too much on the question. Let me just move back to the geopolitical question of the European Union. As I said, this is a really calling for the EU to decide how far it can afford and it would like to enlarge. And what is the geopolitical role it aspires to play? It is again the treaty of the European Union that commits the Union to stand with the values in its neighborhood, and Article 49, right, to again embrace the new members who are defending the European values. And this is definitely the case of Ukraine, which then makes this into a moral imperative for the European Union to grant the candidacy to Ukraine. So and also obviously the threats, having the wars at the doorstep of the European Union, this is a big threat to the European security. What we are now witnessing is immense EU support financially, again, taking into account how small is the European Union's budget, the financial support, the military support, humanitarian support, accepting refugees. EU stands with Ukraine, right? And this again is obviously a burden, right, for the Union right after the pandemic. So if that could be avoided in the future, the war and its consequences, that would definitely be among the advantages for the European Union. And this is again big thing with security. Can the EU afford another wars if the war has to expand to Moldova or to Georgia again, which is very much, which is not really hard to imagine that the geography of the war could be shifted. I think with that I also a bit refer to building democracies. As I said, these countries come with a lot of democratic issues, but again, democracy here and EU support to building democracies again has a geopolitical angle to it. Unfortunately, to the trio countries, it's very difficult. So if the European Union truly wants to build democracies in these countries, then granting candidacy could be the way to actually tie them to the reform and democratic paths. And finally, there is also, I think, good question to ask. With the stack processes with Western Balkans, obviously the EU's enlargement policy has not been fully functional, and I think this is the right moment to reflect on it and to think how that could be reformed, because this is not a role model for new candidate countries, new applicant countries, and there is definitely an issue there with unanimity, the way the enlargement process is in or out. So there is a moment to reflect on it and to reform it to the extent possible, but I think the upcoming summit this Friday should bring new insights on that too. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Speaking of the Western Balkans, that's a question that's come up a number of times from people who have submitted questions online. It's a question that continues to come up. If the Ukraine, I think I've heard someone describe it as the new darling wunderkind, is kind of expedited through the process, given some sort of fast pass or given special treatment. The question is, what message does that send to the Western Balkans? Is that, some say that they're already completely discouraged, have lost hope because of the length of the process, and then seeing Ukraine go through it at an accelerated pace or getting assistance would just kind of add insult to injury. What would you say to that?
That is a good question indeed. The thing is, I don't really see some fast track procedures coming. There is not a legal basis in the EU treaty on that. And granting candidacy neither directly means opening accession talks. We will see if EU member states can agree. They should, I would say, but whether they agree on granting candidacy to Ukraine, Moldova, and later on Georgia, when Georgia is ready for that. So we will see how this goes ahead. Obviously, the Western Balkan countries should not feel ignored or neglected. These, in the ideal, situation, should be in fact an impetus for the European Union then to repair the stack process and finding a compromise with now one member state who has been blocking the starting of the accession talks, right, and moving the accession talks further. So this should actually create an impetus, but again, we will see about it. This is indeed reasonable to see and to foresee the skepticism that could grow in Western Balkans, but they also have some of the countries which now hold the potential candidate status, right, they also have a clear conditions which they have to meet, and this has to be done from their side. For North Macedonia, Albania, indeed, there is a more leading role on the European Union to actually, break through this deadlock situation. And luckily, we can see that the trio now adding to the new applicants can only incentivize the process, because this is again EU's moral obligation to then also like turn to Western Balkans who have been there before. So I have rather optimistic view on that, but we have to really see what will be the outcomes of the summit end of this week.
Okay. And with that, I'm going to turn to our third participant and introduce her. She is also on the screen, Elise Bernard. Elise holds a PhD in public law from the Sorbonne's Institute of European Studies, civilian auditor of the 28th promotion of the École de Guerre de Paris. She currently teaches at the Master Geostrategy Defense and International Security of Sciences Po X at the ESSEC's MBA and sits as an assessor judge at the National Asylum Court as a specialist in post-conflict areas. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Elise.
Thank you very much, Jiva. Thank you all. Thank you to Bruegel. I'm very happy today to share my feelings about the fact, and my thoughts, of course, that the Russian aggression has rekindled a movement of solidarity in Europe that we thought we had lost. And it also confirms for Ukraine 8 years after its European destiny and the domino effect on Georgia and Moldova. Post-Soviet studies are still ongoing and lead us to promote new ways of thinking about the future. Particularly today, when the cruel reality that the economy cannot be healthy without a minimum of rule of law and security. For that, considering security and rule of law as major concerns for all European actors, EU member states, candidate countries, or potential candidate countries, whatever, it's necessary. It would be a mistake to consider, first, the Western Balkans as a periphery of the European Union and on the margins of the decision-making process. And what's happening right now is that a Ukrainian invasion triggered a refreshed interest for the EU enlargement goals and processes. And this is to a certain extent, for the researcher, I am quite satisfying. In this regard, what this context could mean for the Balkans path into the EU, in a certain way, it's quite difficult to answer in 10 minutes, but this will be the main task of the next EU-Balkan Summit of 23-24 of June, the next days. But we, with Europanova, we have some ideas. And the very first idea is that the opportunity arises for rule of law promoters to reclaim the security discourse. Here stands the first factual state of affairs. The security rhetoric had been for too long the flagship of populist speeches, and they use it as a justification for their attacks on the rule of law. The populist movements are primarily responsible for the stalled enlargement process because enlarge the EU implies a very strict definition of the rule of law. Their security objectives are just limited to their regime stability. That's what we can call stabilocracy, as you know. Therefore, one should not be mistaken when considering Ukraine as an EU candidate. The reasons for the opposition are not necessarily the same. And hence, it's important to, and that's the second idea, to seriously distinguish between the different types of opposition to the EU enlargement through their commitment to the rule of law. We have two types of EU enlargement skeptics, I would call them. We can identify them. For sure, the rule of law and security have been at the heart of the problem about enlargement since the Iron Curtain fall, even though most interests seem to focus on the economy. But Those who oppose EU enlargement in view of rule of law see these two issues with two different objectives. You have the one who refuses to see a demanding definition of the rule of law accompanied by security objective in line with it. To illustrate it quite simply, the fight against trafficking in particular. And the other, who believe that the candidate state does not offer the guarantees for a legal order indicative of an attachment to a strict definition of the rule of law. And as a result, their security objectives are not consistent with the guarantee of a European fundamental right. Concretely, they are not able to fight against trafficking in particular. To illustrate my point, just let's go back in 1985. You have Austria, Finland, Sweden. We have no difficulty with the rule of law. Legal orders are similar in the rigor of the definition of the rule of law. Their foreign policy upon accession to the EU was naturally focused on the neighborhood due to the Austrian and Finland neutral status. The common European security did not pose any difficulties as such, and one cannot therefore speak of an extension of the EU doctrine of the rule of law and security at this moment. But on the other side, of the Iron Curtain, a few years later, it's different. It's difficult to talk about community in the definition of the rule of law in former autocracies, former satellites, former Russian, Soviet federated states, didn't say impossible, but difficult for sure. As far as security is concerned, it's even more complicated because there are non-aligned states, Warsaw Pact members, former Warsaw Pact promoters. It's therefore very difficult to have an overview of those who wants to see them as European partners. And what's dramatic currently that the state of affairs at the beginning of the century does not seem to have changed 20 years after. Another quite simple example, if tomorrow Norway starts an EU accession procedure, it will be difficult to find something to complain about, as well as the 1995 precedents with Sweden, Austria, and Finland. So if tomorrow Ukraine gets its status as an EU candidate state, there will be both those opposed to the expansion of the EU and those skeptical about its ability to apply a strict definition of the rule of law because it's a former Soviet federated entity, like Georgia, like Moldova, for that matter. And last but not least, because it has in its population citizens and representatives who prefer the protection of Moscow, as well as the EU candidate Republic of Serbia, by the way, as well as in Bulgaria, an EU member state. And look, Kirill Patkov government is in trouble because of this. And with this in mind, that one can distinguish the different vetos of member states to enlargement. And third and last idea, the moment has come to develop a strategy to influence opponents of enlargement, how to convince first those who reject our undemanding definition of the rule of law. Do we really want to try to convince the opponents of the European rule of law? Does France, Germany, the EU want to convince them? And is it necessary? Directing influence towards these audiences is a very serious question. First, because citizens of states with little commitment to the rule of law have a strong tendency to leave these countries. I was reading a few days ago a very interesting collection of testimonies published by Euronews Untitled, Russia's brain drain, war with Ukraine prompts tens of thousands to flee abroad. Very interesting. They're all already convinced. These people are already convinced. Secondly, communicating that EU enlargement is not a danger in itself, and it will not contradict the Kremlin's propaganda to endorse its worldview and those who accept it with more or less favor. I'm not judging, but communicating that respect for the rule of law does not compromise security requirements seems to me much more interesting. And not only for these skeptics, but also for the others. Here stands the main question: how to convince those who expect the maximum in terms of guarantees in the rule of law. Because if a minimum of security is not established, it will be impossible, first of all, because for there to be a rule of law, there must be a state, a sovereign state that's indisputable in its territorial integrity, its population, and the existence of a legitimate government. And this Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia application, unimaginable at the beginning of the French presidency of the EU Council, they're being submitted at a particularly critical time with the coming EU-Balkan summit. We are facing a war, and we have an application by a country in war. And unfortunately, there's no EU doctrine on warring and occupied states. About state in war, the Balkans presidents of the 90s highlighted the need for European political will, but there's no doctrine. Perhaps a little embroilment with Ukraine is beginning, but nothing more. Now there is any doctrine about an occupied state. The specific situation of Cyprus has not prevented part of the island from becoming a member of the EU. This may or not be welcome, but the North is still manifesting a frozen conflict, and that is likely to be found in eastern Ukraine. And we cannot avoid this issue with Moldova and Transnistria, with Georgia and South Ossetia, and we will face the same problem than the Serbian Kosovo precedent, probably if decisions are not taken, and I hope they will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elise. You mentioned something interesting. You talk about expectations and maybe some expectations that some have that won't be met, that are hard to meet. Some say that Macron's proposal to create a European political community was perhaps came out of something like that, of expectations and the ability to meet them or not. And I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you think that the Russian war highlights the limits of the EU?
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, these limitations are absolutely not recent, and there was obviously no urgency to address them. That's a little bit sad. And here stands the first limit, explaining the opposition to enlargement. So far, the EU is based on economy and connected to rule of law, and with the war, EU will have to switch from an economy-based vision to a politics-based vision. Peace and stability in the Western Balkans are political. Rule of law deficiencies will not be solved with trade agreements. The same with the war in Ukraine. So meeting the expectations, for those who oppose enlargement for fear of not respecting the rule of law seems, again, to me, a priority. I always thought so personally, but today more than ever, it's becoming clear that the enlargement was only one item of the European development, and this is becoming a core item of the EU. the very essence of European construction is pragmatism. And today we have three new candidates who certainly have ambitions in economic matters and the rule of law, but above all, peace and security. They need guarantees and protection because, frankly, after the Maidan events, one can clearly ask, what does the EU do, politically speaking, for its neighbors? I'm a little upset. These countries are struggling for their independence, for their existence, and if they fail, they will disappear as they already disappeared during their history. That's very important. These countries will never join NATO, so the EU can only become a defense and security organization for its neighbors to protect itself and to consider it as a way of development. And I understand Macron's proposal in that field because it therefore aimed at those who want to link enlargement to basic guarantees of the rule of law, a minimum of states and a minimum of security. Of course, it's not ideal. But at least it's something. Currently, you know, we have 7 countries engaged in the accession process. Whether or not their application was submitted, accepted, it implies how to organize Europe from a political point of view. Macron's proposal to create a European political community has to be about concrete issues. I mean, I hope seriously concrete issues without substituting the EU membership or enlargement process in itself, for sure. We need concrete proposals and promote the complementarity of the two approaches, the European political community and the EU membership. We probably need to re-inaugurate this enlargement process in the interest of Eastern European countries for 3 new applicants, because we have to admit that the question of accession as a member has not to be rushed, because we will lose the first opponents, those who think that the country is not ready to answer to the rule of law requirements.
Tina or Ilona, do you have anything to add to that?
Maybe we go first to Ilona.
Okay, Ilona?
Yeah, thank you. I would like to thank Elisa for bringing up this issue of political vision of the EU. Really, I think it's time to think about, we call it political, probably to think about values, right? Whether that we are protecting values or whether we think about GDP. And sometimes we have to sacrifice some part of the GDP to protect values. And also one small remark about NATO. Actually, the aspirations of Ukraine towards EU and NATO are embedded into Ukraine's constitution. Although we don't, of course, expect to be fast, but nevertheless, this is the final goal. So, however distant, but it's the goal of Ukraine, nevertheless, to join both of these unions.
Okay.
Tina?
No, I just want to again resonate with the previous speaker on the rule of law reforms. As I said, these are indeed very, very important, and I think that's what will be taken into account by the member states. But again, as I said, we should not forget that this is the process, and without progress on that, I don't see accession talks going forward. So I think this is just implied by the enlargement process the way it is. And I also wanted to join the other speaker on saying that complementarity between the Macron's idea and the accession could indeed be a good one, because as we already witnessed through the Eastern Partnership policy, ambiguity has been enough in this turbulent region. If the EU wants to actually enlarge to the east, that should be now clear, because that was delayed, that was unclear exactly for not irritating Russia, but it just really doesn't work. It was a mistake, we see it clearly. So more ambiguity will not help this time. More concrete proposals and clear ideas what this could lead, whether this could lead to the EU membership or not.
Okay. I'm going to ask if there are any questions here in the audience, and I see that there's one hand up, and it is Maria, and we have a microphone coming.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the speakers. You brought out very hard questions, and a list of very hard questions, actually. So I wanted to ask, I wanted to add one, because I think it's important. It's not difficult, certainly for this audience here, to understand the symbolism behind the decision this week. I mean, granting candidate status carries a lot of symbolism that, quite frankly, is very necessary. And I have absolutely no problem seeing that. But I mean, as Elise said in her comments, in her many interesting points, you know, Ukraine in particular is fighting for existence right now. And that's, you know, that's a lot more than symbolism, and therefore requires, as Elisa says, security guarantees. So I'm coming back to the argument and to the question that Andre raised in the first session, which is, to what extent do you really believe that beyond the symbolism, the EU can provide those security guarantees? Huh? And, you know, you need common foreign policy. Do you really see sufficient, not will, but sufficient common ground for security to be provided to a country that needs it the most today?
Okay, who would like to take that first?
I can maybe
Okay.
start.
Okay,
And
Tina.
then, indeed, so first of all, the Treaty of the European Union, the security refers only to the members of the European Union, right? So granting candidacy will not really solve this. Voila. So indeed, and the question is, they're neither the members of NATO, and then we don't know when they will become the members of the European Union to trigger then this Article 42, which is there. But again, the question is whether what can EU offer as a security. Now we see the strategic compass only now coming out on the security and defense, and a good point here is that eastern neighbors, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova in particular, are mentioned multiple times, but this is the first time that we see that acknowledged by the European Union, that these are indeed the conflicts in these areas, military invasions are threats to the European Union. So the EU has been very slow to singling that out, and then the way it can react to it, this is still, I see that very much work in progress, because what does EU have in terms of the budget? What does EU have in terms of the military, resources? Well, not really much, right? This way, security can actually be, for the security, these countries should really turn to the NATO, and many, as they see now that the broken promises, the promises of basically becoming the NATO members back then, more than a decade ago, was indeed could be now the mistake that we are witnessing the war again. But it's a very good question, and it's something that EU has as a work in progress. And the skepticism here, the fear here is that because of its internal disagreements, EU always has been lacking common approach in its foreign and security policy. And with unanimity, that is just really under a big question mark.
You respond? Elise or Elena?
If I may add on this question, so what can be done right now? I think the EU has already been doing its both provision of weapons and to Ukraine and imposing sanctions on Russia. So on the one hand, you strengthen the ability of Ukrainian army to fight, because now obviously everything is decided in the battlefield, and on the other hand, undermining the ability of Russia to fight. So if you ask about immediate things or what can be done today, and today these are two things that can be done.
Elise, do you have anything to add?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your question. Of course, the first acceptation from the Commission, from the European Commission for the favorable opinion about the three countries as candidates is a very good message, a very geostrategic, well-chosen message. For that, okay, no problem with it. What about the member states? That's the decision we are waiting for. That's exactly what I explained. I mean, who is against what? That's very important to qualify the situation, because before giving any advice, that was the main aim of my rationale. Right now, more than recognize a country as a candidate or potential candidate, or no matter how you call him, it's very necessary, it's absolutely necessary to engage very concrete things. Because honestly, Ukrainian people today, if they're trusting in the EU, I'm very proud and very happy for that. They're first waiting for security. It's quite urgent to propose very concrete actions. Just let me give you an example. Between France and Bosnia and Herzegovina, you have some security police and trafficking mission, fight against trafficking missions organized all together. It works quite well. I mean, you are not necessarily to be a candidate to establish some very concrete actions in the field of security. With Kosovo also. Okay, it's bilateral, but it's a reality. It became really urgent to propose some very concrete things, because maybe, as you know, our favorite Eurosceptic, Boris Johnson, proposed to Ukraine and Poland to create an economic and military alliance against Russia, which will be, and he announced it like an alternative to the European Union, with a common training program for the Ukrainian army. And that's my question. Does the Ukrainian population prefer that kind of proposal? Or just waiting for the decision of some countries to recognize them the status of candidate of the EU? It's a very serious question, and I think we have to hurry. Now, let's be honest, who are the countries who will be against the status of the Ukrainian and Georgia and Moldova candidate status? Maybe not the same as usual. Okay, several questions, again, more questions, but I'm sorry, I'm not sure I answered your expectations.
No, but you did answer with a few questions, and I would like to put them, ask Ilana or Tina if you would like to respond to any of those.
Ilana can go ahead.
Okay, Ilana, why don't you go ahead?
Unfortunately, I cannot tell what the Ukrainian population prefers this union with Poland and Britain. I haven't seen these surveys, so I don't have the data to support that. But the support for the EU is very high, and I think quite high share of Ukrainians understand that this will require also internal changes from Ukraine, like introduction of reforms, etc.
Tina, I ask you, you are a Georgian national, and as we saw yesterday, there were more than 60,000 people out in the streets of the capital, sending a message to Brussels. Being a national, you know, what could you tell us? What is the expectation? What is what is the expectation? What are people? What do message they want to send to Brussels, and what are they willing to do for that?
That is, I think, a very good question, and question I've been receiving a lot these days, because Georgia is a very confusing case to many. Now, starting from the avis of the Commission last Friday, we all saw it. It's a very carefully drafted document. We see with the Ukraine and Moldova granting candidacy status on the understanding that, and Georgia granting candidacy status once the country, and then the listed priorities. So the starting point is seeing that Georgia has the longest list of the priorities to be implemented, and at the same time scores the highest on nearly every criteria, accession criteria, when it comes to the implementation of the association agreement and the long documents. However, for the European Commission, obviously the main weight in the decision was given to the current developments. Current, I have in mind, over the past 2-3 years, basically since the presidential elections, when there was observed vote buying behavior, basically growing informal governance. On the corruption, Georgia even outperforms some of the EU member states. However, the direction of the reforms is now, regress. Level of the reforms is high. However, the direction is going a bit backwards and not doing enough for the human rights, media freedom, and all that. So the Commission gave the weight to the most recent, in a way, events, and I think this was a right decision to just send a clear message, to the country that, the country is not on the right track. You have to work on it, and I think that was only fair. However, on the other hand, there is the people, right? And this is a very difficult situation, because the EU membership is not being granted, candidacy is not being granted to any political party, to any government. It's granted to the people of a given country. On the other hand, this is the government who represents the people. This is the government who is responsible for the reforms. And if there is no strong political will to undertake the reforms, there is a big question mark, there is a problem, and there is this headache. How do we deal with Georgia now? So the demonstration yesterday, and I think this is going to go ahead for the next week, sends the only clear message that the Georgians, as this is shown in the public polls and surveys, there is overwhelming support for the European future of Georgia. More than 80% of the Georgians choose their European future. Country also went into the war with Russia. Obviously, this was a short war, but Georgia is minuscule as well. So given its size, this was still back then a quite strong response that the Georgians want to have independent democratic state, not under the Russian influence, right? So that the message of the population is very clear. The question is how this leads to what do we do then to force the government to actually show the true commitments to taking the reforms. When people can go vote, they have their strong will, but if there is the issues with elections, faking them, what do you do with it, right? But I think this is why granting candidacy is a very, very strong pointer and incentive for such fragile democracies. When there is a public will, the granting candidacy is a pressure, is an impulse that, you have this public requesting you to do these reforms. If you don't do it, then you are not going to be granted that. And I don't think the Georgian population would forgive that to any government. So this is basically, in a nutshell, the Georgian case. The fears here are that Georgia should not really be decoupled from the trio, Moldova and Ukraine, because, as I said, the geography of war can be easily shifted, and Georgia, in fact, is extremely vulnerable because of sharing a very long border of Russia with Russia, and 20% of the country is still under Russian occupation. So this is not to be, underlooked, because this again is the headache of the European Union. Would the war expands now to Georgia, then you should support the country. So can this be avoided? And indeed, undertaking reforms, but also not strategically decoupling Georgia from the trio would actually make sense for securing the more peaceful development and growth of the European continent.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Maybe I have one or points more
Yes.
following Tina.
Yes, go ahead, Elise.
Thank you. Thank you, Tina, because what you explained remembers me exactly what's happening in most of EU candidates, of Western Balkans candidates, because the EU is supporting legislative reforms, but the EU is also partnering with governments who won't necessarily deliver reforms. And the enlargement, considering this, is not based on ground. That's why I was explaining the importance of the communication, how we have, what we have to communicate for those who want demanding rule of law, because populations in the Western Balkans, some of them also want it. Because when it's about security, it's not about the danger coming from outside, it's also the danger from inside. In other words, corruption. So it's very important to show the civil society, organized or not, we are with them. Member states, the EU, because for the moment, currently, civil society is left out from enlargement policy. It's unfortunately now only based on governments. And when you have some discutable governments, one cannot say the enlargement will be a success. Again, in reference to what I explained at the beginning, to communicate to the citizens of the candidate country or potential candidate countries, the security contribution of the Union is absolutely indispensable, because it's, you already heard about Euro fatigue, the Western Balkans Euro fatigue. You have two types of Euro fatigue. You have the government ones who will explain you that the EU is very on demand and they're not clear, they're changing their mind. And you also, and more important again, the Euro fatigue from the people, because they're just discouraging about the fact that the EU is able to fight against the corruption in their countries. And that's a very, very important point we have to develop from the member states and within the EU and with our European partners, whatever the name you give to them.
Okay. Ilana, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would like to support actually this point because really in the last years in Ukraine reforms were pushed because the government was like in a sandwich, you know, between civil society and international organizations like Euro Commission, the IMF, and so on. So really, these are your partners in the country. And one small point about communication. Actually, I'm very glad that some of the Russian propaganda channels have been turned off in the EU recently, and in Ukraine as well. But sometimes, you know, you hear when you turn off those Russia Today or something that this is an attack on the freedom of speech, and I think this concept should also be somehow reconsidered, because closing off propaganda is not an attack on freedom of speech, right?
Okay. Thank you, Ilana. Are there any more questions from the audience? There's a security. I want to go back to security for just a second. There are some that say, although territorial integrity is not, you know, a prerequisite, that it is assumed that candidates would have territorial integrity. Being that Ukraine is a country in conflict, and that both of Moldova and Georgia have also conflict with Russia, is that, how would you respond? Is that more of a reason, or is that something that should be resolved before a candidacy would go further?
what I regret first is that we didn't resolve it when it was possible to resolve it. It's a pity, seriously. I'm much more upset about those who abandoned the question from the beginning of our century. We could have had some discussions about. We never had it. That's very hard because today the question. I think it's a bad idea to make it as if this wasn't the reality, you know. So does the question must be resolved before having the candidate status or not? I don't have a serious answer to give you because my first answer is I would like to prefer that the debate and the answer had been decided 20 years ago, seriously, before the accession of Cyprus, for sure. To give you a moment. Now, the question has been to resolved for sure before becoming a member. That's absolutely certain, because how can I say? Having an occupied territory within a member state of the EU complicates the situation a lot. Look what's happening with Cyprus again, and with the gas. The gas they found in the Mediterranean. They're already facing problem with Turkey and with the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. We will probably not find any solution within the 10 or 15 years just because of this frozen conflict in the north of the island. I mean, everything will become complicated. Another point we have to underline that these frozen conflict territories, they are perfect places for corruption and for traffics. Never forget that. Some people are very happy with these frozen and occupied territories because it's the perfect place to develop the human and weapons traffic. Seriously.
Should I? Yeah, indeed, very pertinent comments from Elise. I would just say here that with Moldova, with Transnistria, well, Moldova has the DCFTA with the European Union, and actually DCFTA in this case covers Transnistria. Why? Because there was strong interest from the Transnistria not to lose out while trading with the European Union. And when it became clear for Transnistria that the European Union was not in the position, was not willing to cooperate with Transnistria, then they have joined the CFTA. And I think this is a very good indicator how the breakaway regions treat the potential scenarios. For them, again, this is a division between European Union and Russia. These are the breakaway regions, as Elise was saying. They are the buffer zones of this like bad disinformation, trafficking. It's a military base. In Georgia's case, South Ossetia, it's a military base of Russia, right? There is areas which then Russia is using for its different purposes to implement its policies, right? And this is very tricky, and Russia has been able to trigger it because, again, there is the story narratives that Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, these are failed countries, failed democracies. They don't have future. They don't have future with the European Union. So for the breakaway regions, that was more of a choice, you know, okay, then let's be in between, let's be towards Russia. And as this becomes clear, as these countries have European perspectives, then this can actually, in a way, make these breakaway regions more, you know, thoughtful. Are we missing actually out? And this was the case with the Transnistria. Obviously, these conflicts are very different in their nature, and they have a long history. Okay, with Georgia's case, there is Abkhazia, but there is zero links, right? There is no trade going on. There is no economic cooperation going on, and which is very worrisome because if you have at least some sort of cooperation going on, on, then there is a prospect for resolving it. But with these changes, I think they also become aware that they have been in a vacuum in a way, and I still believe the conflict should be resolved internally because they have some cultural, historical background. Obviously, EU support will be crucial, but this has to come from internal efforts between the breakaway regions and the countries. And again, clear path towards EU membership could only help in this way. And if the breakaway regions, decide not to then get along with their countries, it's also their choice. At least it will be, they will see what choices they have, and they will basically react to it.
Okay.
I would like to add, if I might, to this question, that it's very important to keep the right perspective and the right view on the issue, because Russia has been trying for 8 years to force Ukraine to talk to so-called people's republics, but those are just occupied areas, and this fake government is not a government, it's a Kremlin's puppets. So this was, I think, a mistake that Moldova made when they started talking to Transnistria administration, which was in fact also and is a Kremlin's puppet. So I will not comment on Georgia. Maybe there's some different situation there, but there are no breakaway regions or some nations that want their independence or whatsoever. These are conflicts created by Russia and territories occupied by Russia, and so Russia is responsible and is the side of negotiations if you want to liberate those territories.
Yeah. Again, just a little point, Ilona. I'm totally agree with your thought. I just would like to precise. It's not a reason to condemn a federative organization. I mean, states can respect their national and linguistic specificity. There's no problem with that. The EUs agree with that. Most of member states, I agree with that. What was the main problem with Transnistria was the presence of the Russian army. I mean, we already had the presence of the Russian army close to the EU and close to the NATO. I mean, considering this moment, we are facing fake news explaining that the fault of NATO was its weapons too close of Russia. No. I'm sorry. Russian army first had its army in Moldova, and we cannot let people forget that.
Sure. Yeah, that was I was saying. Thank you.
Okay. I would ask if there are any more questions from the audience here. And if not, I will wrap it up and say thank you very much to our participants. As I mentioned, their contributions will be coming out in a forthcoming issue of Internomics, which will be available online in July. And I thank you all very much for being here in person and on the screen, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.